This is dedicated to the homies that was down since day one. Welcome to Drop D.
Okay. Welcome into the Dallas Action presented by Wall Street Window. Thank you for joining me for this special episode. It is a special episode, so in lieu of the normal greetings and the whole normal thing, the normal opening, we're just going to get right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to play you a soundbite now. The soundbite, let me look at my notes, is from the May 19th of this year episode of Black Op Radio. Listen carefully.
If you remember, like Bob Clark and Doug Campbell, they actually devoted a show. What was it called? The Lies of Fletcher Prouty?
Yeah, The Lies of Fletcher Prouty. What a joke.
Yeah.
What an embarrassment. I mean,
the next soundbite, ladies and gentlemen, is also Len Osanick on Black Op Radio from the March 17th episode of that show. Take a listen.
But I heard some other guys had done a show about the lies of Fletcher Prouty, and I just laughed. I said, well, the show's over. They've just discredited themselves.
First soundbite again. Listen very carefully.
If you remember, like Bob Clark and Doug Campbell, they actually devoted a show. What was it called? The Lies of Fletcher Prouty?
Yeah, The Lies of Fletcher Prouty. What a joke.
Yeah.
What an embarrassment.
Dear listeners, what Mr. DiEugenio said there, Bob Clark and Doug Campbell, they actually devoted a show. What was it called? The Lies of Fletcher Prouty? And Mr. Osanick replying, yeah, The Lies of Fletcher Prouty. Let me give you, the listener, an example of an exchange, a hypothetical exchange that contains the exact same amount of factual accuracy as the exchange I just quoted you. I just played you. It's as if I were to go on Quick Hits, the podcast that I do with Rob Clark, and say, hey, Rob, if you remember, Len Osanick and Dim DiEugenio devoted a whole show to Clay Shaw. What was it called? Tight Butts Drive Me Nuts. It's ridiculous. See, that exchange, the hypothetical one, between Rob and myself that I just gave you, contains the same amount of factual accuracy as the exchange I played you from Black Op Radio. That is zero. Because they absolutely did not dedicate a show called Tight Butts Drive Me Nuts, did they? On the show they do together. Dear listeners, please understand this. Rob Clark and I only do one show together, and that's Quick Hits. And Rob Clark and I have never, ever devoted an episode of Quick Hits titled Fletcher Prouty is a Liar, or The Lies of Fletcher Prouty. Never. If you're going to criticize someone publicly, you have a responsibility to do your homework and get the details right. But, as we have seen, Mr. DiEugenio rarely lets the responsibility to get the details right deter him from an opportunity to criticize someone in public. Case in point, let's look at his review of Dr. John Newman's book, Into the Storm. This review was published, guys, at Kennedy's and King in September of 2021. Back on Quick Hits, episode 26 from October 23rd of that year, about a month later, I reviewed Jim DiEugenio's book review because he absolutely positively 100% got it wrong. I'm going to read you this sentence. Or no, I'm going to read you the whole paragraph. Paragraph 8 of Part 3 of the Kennedys and King review of Dr. John Newman's book, Into the Storm. I want you to listen carefully now. The paragraph begins, Newman admits that there was a female contact who worked for Veciana who communicated messages to him from Phillips. That's the CIA's David Atlee Phillips. And he cites Newman, page 83. Dolores Cowell had been Veciana's secretary, and she recalled messages from a man who used the name Bishop. According to Larry Hancock in 1963, there was another woman who was used for messaging later. Veciana recalled her name as Pruitt. This had to have been Virginia Pruitt, who Phillips worked with in propaganda operations. John also admits that some CIA agents stayed on the island after the revolution, and Veciana named one of them who appeared to be an associate of Phillips. But he ruled out the possibility that Phillips would have ever returned because he had no diplomatic immunity since he was not under State Department cover. That is the entire paragraph. But it's this first whopper of a Fugazi sentence. Newman admits that there was a female contact who worked for Veciana, Mr. DiEugenio wrote, who communicated messages to him from Phillips, David Atlee Phillips of the CIA. And he cites Newman, page 83. I read this. I was sitting in my office here at work, eating my lunch. Almost fell backwards out of my chair because I know this book. I know this book. I only have 6 books in my office, guys, that are of a personal nature. 3 of them are JFK assassination books. 2 of them are Watergate books, and 1 of them is a Sherlock Holmes anthology. And one of those JFK assassination research books is a personally signed, inscribed copy that is well worn of the book Into the Storm. So I pulled it down, and I read over and over. From page 83, the page that Mr. DiEugenio erroneously cites, I backed up to page 77 and read forward to page 88. Not once, not twice, over and over and over again. I went back and I went forward and I read, all the while continually asking myself, what the hell did I miss? And I read it again because Dr. Newman does not admit any such thing. What he does, dear readers, is report the allegation as made to Anthony Summers. And that's the truth of the section of that book. But I wanted to know. Even though I'd read it over and over again, I wanted to make damn sure that I was right, that I wasn't missing something. I wanted to make damn sure that I had the details right. You know what I mean? So that day on the way home, I made a phone call. I called Alan Dale. Alan Dale, for many years, has served as the primary administrative research assistant to Dr. John Newman through this entire volume of books, including the next one, including the one that's going to be released in several weeks, including Into the Storm, the one that Mr. DiEugenio blew the review of. I called Alan Dale on the phone. He has been deeply involved in the continuing work of Dr. Newman for years, including this. And not only is Alan Dale all of those things, he is a well-respected, oh my God, one of the most knowledgeable assassination researchers I know. And he's also the director of the Assassination Archives Research Center, published, respected author, and he's a dear friend and brother to me. So I called him that day, and he answered the phone. I said, Alan, dude, hang on. You got to hear something. Have you read the Kennedys and King review of the book? And he said, no. I said, can you hang on, let me park? So I hit a parking lot, and I pulled up the screenshot, and I read the paragraph. The paragraph in question from page 83 of Newman's book to Alan Dale. And I said, Alan, what am I missing? You know I know this book, especially the Vesiana stuff. You know this. Alan, I've read this section over and over. What am I missing that Jim DiEugenio did not? Because as far as I can see, Dr. Newman admits absolutely no such thing on page 83 or anywhere around it or anywhere in that book. Again, Alan, what am I missing? And dear listeners, students of the assassination, Alan sighed. And he replied, you didn't miss anything, Doug. Your analysis is 100% correct. And I said, so this reviewer, I said, Alan, this guy has established himself as the literary critic of note for this type of writing. This is an important book covering important material from an important author. I said, Alan, you'd think he'd feel a responsibility to, and Alan Dale cut me off mid-sentence right there, and he finished my sentence for me. He said, to get it right? And I said, yeah, to get it right. And Alan sighed, guys, and he went, yes, you'd think. That's Dr. Newman's right-hand man. Now, for his part, Mr. Osanick at Black Op Radio, I remember distinctly when he and DiEugenio discussed the review briefly on Black Op Radio, and I'm paraphrasing, but some of the words are spot on. Mr. Osanick said that not only did he not bother having Dr. Newman on his show, he didn't even bother reading the book because he's just not interested in anything that seems to maybe point the finger away from CIA. This next part I'm going to add, no matter how true it might be. Just not even bothering to read it because you heard it might conflict with what you believe. That is the very dictionary definition of cognitive dissonance. It could not be more diametrically opposite critical thought. Dr. Newman and Alan Dale are digging deep, doing deep, profound work in this field, especially as it relates to the Vesiana Maurice Bishop problem, with information, with materials, with facts, with documents, with resources that the late, great Gaten Fonzie never dreamed we'd have access to. And Dr. Newman is trying to teach us. He's trying to show us what was really real and what looks to have been completely made up. He's trying to teach us. Mr. Osanick, that's not only an unwillingness to, it's not even an unwillingness to learn. It's an outright refusal. You know, Mr. Osanick is fond of using the phrase, the poverty of it all. Mr. Osanick's attitude and thinking toward Dr. Newman's important work, that shit's so poverty-stricken it tried to bum 50 cents from a crackhead. The crackhead felt bad for it. Gave it a whole $1. Had Mr. DiEugenio and Mr. Osanick bothered to do their homework and get the details right, then that exchange I played you at the top of the show, guys, would have went something like this. Mr. DiEugenio, having the details correct, maybe would have said something like, well, then, if you remember, Rob Clark, not Bob Clark, but Rob Clark, the host of the Lone Gunman podcast and co-host of a JFK assassination research podcast called Quick Hits with Doug Campbell, did a guest host solo spot on the Midnight Rider news show that was called Clark on Prouty. He did this episode in October of 2020. Yeah, y'all getting that? However, this episode, titled Clark on Prouty, was uploaded at Loose Moose Productions' podcast page From the Vault on that channel, one of 6, with the title The Life and Lies of Fletcher Prouty. Campbell, for his part, wrote and uploaded an episode of his long-running JFK assassination research podcast, The Dallas Action, that was also very critical of Colonel Prouty, titled Diversionary Ramblings and Imagined Scenarios, L. Fletcher Prouty and the JFK Hit. Campbell did this episode back in August of 2020, 2 months before Clark's solo Midnight Rider news episode. See, those are the details. See, Bob Clark and Doug Campbell did not do such a show together. But that doesn't keep them from continually repeating it as if it were true. We're going to get to more examples of that in just a minute. But first, we're going to look at the article published in Kennedy's and King last week titled Fletcher Prouty and the ARRB. This article, guys, it was foreshadowed, previewed, talked about for quite a while on Black Op Radio leading up to its publication. And we, Rob Clark and myself, we always seem to come up in a vague way, vaguely referred to. And this mangled nonsense regarding which podcast was actually done by who that was critical of Prouty. But we kept coming up in vague ways, being, like I said, being referred to. As if maybe in a way the article was ultimately inspired in some part by our critical questions of Fletcher Prouty. As if it were in a way an answer to, a response to, specifically questions raised by Rob on that solo show guest host spot that he did. Well, some of the same questions that Rob asked on that show, I asked too specifically. I asked also on the episode of the Dallas Action, number 174, Diversionary Ramblings and Imagined Scenarios, that I did solo in August of 2020. And if this article was in any way a response to any of those questions, it was a big, fat whiff. Because only one single, solitary, specific, critical question regarding Prouty that either of us has ever raised was actually addressed in this article at Kennedy's and King. Now, one of several questions regarding Colonel Prouty that we both asked at different times some 2 years ago. One does have to do with the ARRB. It is a specific question asked of Colonel Prouty. Asked by the ARRB during his interview. This was not addressed whatsoever in the article. And we both asked the question. It was in that episode that Rob did. Now, we all know that Colonel Prouty was indeed in New Zealand at the time of the president's murder. It's a very famous story. Prouty seeing the details of Oswald in the murder in a New Zealand newspaper. I believe it was called the Christchurch Star. Is that correct? But why was Prouty in New Zealand? That, too, is a famous story. It's because he had been in the South Pole on a trip. Now, in the film JFK, the Prouty character, Mr. X, is summoned to the office of the General Ed Lansdale character, General Y. You're going to the South Pole. And he says, what? Me? Why? In the movie, the character portrayed by Donald Sutherland is absolutely stunned. This clip from the movie JFK.
Anyway, after I came back, I asked myself, why was I, the chief of special ops, selected to travel to the South Pole at that time to do a job that any number of others could have done? And I wondered if it could have been because one of my routine duties, if I had been in Washington, would have been to arrange for additional security in Texas.
Texas, that was the last word. Okay, now, you know what we're going to do? We're going to read what Colonel Prouty had to say. Colonel Prouty himself had to say about this trip in his book, JFK, the CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate John F. Kennedy. New York Citadel Press, 1992, on page 284. Same thing. Here's what Prouty wrote. This trip had nothing to do with my previous 9 years of work, except that I had supported CIA activity in Antarctica over the years. I have always wondered, Colonel Prouty wrote, deep in my own heart, whether that strange invitation that removed me so far from Washington, strange invitation, and from the center of all things clandestine that I knew so well might have been connected to the events that followed. Were there things I knew or would have discovered that made it wise to have me far from Washington? Now, we're told, ladies and gentlemen, over and over, that trip was arranged because Colonel Prouty had to be gotten out of the way for the conspiracy to murder Kennedy to work. So Lansdale sent him on this insane, out-of-the-blue trip to the South Pole. We're told, we're urged to believe that at the Assassination Records Review Board, these two guys, Tim Ray and Chris Barger, it really had it in for Prouty. They were going to sandbag him, trip him up, give him the old bait and switch. Again, I'm going to read that paragraph from Prouty's book again. This trip had nothing to do with my previous 9 years of work, except that I had supported CIA activity. In Antarctica over the years. I have always wondered deep in my own heart whether that strange invitation that removed me so far from Washington and from the center of all things clandestine that I knew so well might have been connected to the events that followed. Were there things I knew or would have discovered? Hey, look here, guys. If Tim Ray and Chris Barger were out to screw Prouty, then Ray effing blew it when he asked about the sinister connotations of the South Pole trip. His question truly could not have been less leading, less deceptive, and more straightforward and simple. Here we go. Let me ask you a question about the JFK film. And my question here, well, let me provide a little context for this. Ray continues, I understand that Oliver Stone has said publicly, and I think you have acknowledged, that you contributed advice and background to the film. And in fact, the character played by Donald Sutherland, this X character, is at least loosely based on you. Now, that character, of course, recounts the story of a trip to Antarctica. One thing I wanted to ask about that is that in the film, the character says something to the effect of, one of my routine duties, had I been in Washington, would have been to arrange additional security in Texas. And the conclusion that the film seems to draw is that this trip to Antarctica was sort of purposely done to get this person out of the way, out of Washington, and so ease the way for conspirators to take their shot at the president. But I guess my question now about the Antarctica trip is, do you feel that you were somehow sent to Antarctica for some sinister purpose to get you out of the... Oh, no! Colonel Prouty cuts him off. I'd been working with them since 1959. It was so routine for them to call me that I didn't give it a thought. It was so routine for them to call me, I didn't give it a thought, said Colonel Prouty. And when they said, we've got this team of people going down in a military plane, it's the military custom to put an escort officer on board. And so my boss said, you're escort officer for this flight to Antarctica. I thought, fine. And that's all it was. It was just like that, Colonel Prouty says. And then when I found out that it was this nuclear plant, I thought, wow, this is interesting. I got all the books I could and everything, so I would know what the hell's going on. But I had nothing. I never figured Kennedy was going to be killed or anything else. And even afterward, when I heard people extrapolating in that sense, thinking that it wasn't my job, well, they didn't know that I'd already been doing that since 1959. I'd never heard one of them say that, yet that's the record. I mean, apparently they haven't taken the time to take out the records from the Antarctic offices, because there's a record there, signed by the man who sent me this very nice commendation letter. Prouty cuts the guy off. He cuts the guy. Oh, no, I'd been working with them since 59. It was so routine for them to call me that I didn't give it a thought. Now, we're told he knew the score. He just gave them lip service. He just told them what they wanted to hear. And what are we supposed to say to that? Way to go, Fletch. Way to stick it to the man, Fletch. Way to lie, Fletch. Mr. DiEugenio is fond of telling us, don't even read the interview transcript. Because if you do, you only get 10% of the story. And then Mr. Osanick says, yeah, because he just said screw it and told them what they wanted to hear. He knew the score. He knew they weren't interested in the truth, so he just told them whatever. Do not, fellow rational students, lose sight of the fact that what you're being repeatedly, continually urged to completely disregard in this are the actual words that came out of L. Fletcher Prouty's mouth when he spoke to the ARRB. Don't lose sight of that. Because for the stuff he said before, the conspiratorial stuff, to be true, what he told the ARRB in an instant like this must not be. See, they don't want you to read this interview transcript because the answers that he actually gave when he spoke out loud look very, very bad for Fletcher Prouty, and that's the truth. See, regarding the South Pole trip, now here's where people are a little mixed up. See, maybe getting the wrong idea. It's my contention that Fletcher Prouty did not lie to the Assassination Records Review Board. It is my contention and my conviction that Prouty absolutely told the stone-cold 100% truth. That in reality, Ed Lansdale did not send him on that trip to get him out of the way for conspiratorial reasons. In reality, there was nothing sinister about it. And I 100% believe Mr. Prouty when he says that in reality, he himself never, at any time considered it conspiratorial, suspicious, or sinister. He was telling the truth there. But, no. They weren't interested in the truth. He knew the score, so he just told them what they wanted to hear. So, in order to reaffirm that what he first wrote is true, we have to insist that what he said was not. We're admitting that he has lied, and we're just picky about when and why. Now, that for me is a problem, and it should be. It should be for anybody with even the slightest capacity for reason. I would like to take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to request respectfully that Kennedy's and King please put together an article and publish it that carefully outlines the following. A, exactly where Colonel Prouty told the truth so I can suspend, well, so all of us can suspend critical thought and believe it wholeheartedly and unquestionably with complete blind faith, and B, outlines carefully where he said, screw it, these guys don't want to know the truth, and just told them what they wanted to hear. So I, too, can rationalize and excuse it away. I won't hold my breath. Now, another question that I asked about Colonel Prouty, a critical question on episode number 174 of the Dallas Action, and Rob asked on his solo spot at the Midnight Rider News Show, guys, it was the biggest question I had. The two little ARRB questions I asked, those were at the beginning of the show, in the first half, along with two others that were not about the ARRB. But the one I covered longest and last, the entire second half of the episode, that was the most important one for me. The most important question, critical question about Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty that I asked, it had to do with a letter that Prouty wrote to Harold Weisberg on April 19th of 1989. Again, this subject ghosted in the Kennedys and King article. This letter was written on April 19th, 1989, less than 3 months after the inauguration of President George H.W. Bush. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because I know, not believe, ladies and gentlemen, I know. Because my studies are not at a state of arrested development in 1998. I know that the ridiculous BS conspiracy buff fluff fairy tale that the Bay of Pigs invasion was given its operational designation Operation Zapata because it was named after George Bush's oil company. I know this to be utter nonsense. I know for a fact. The name came from the fact that the Bay of Pigs itself is actually located on Cuba's, listen very carefully, Mr. Osanick, Zapata Peninsula. If you look at a map of Cuba, right above where it says Bay of Pigs, it says in giant letters, Zapata. And you know, the Bay of Pigs itself, the actual beach, the actual place that Brigade 2506 landed, is surrounded, and a map of Cuba will show you this too, is surrounded, guys, on 3 of 4 sides by a swamp that is 1,681 square miles of swampland. Guess what it's called? It's called the Zapata Swamp. So if you look at a map of Cuba, you say the Bay of Pigs, and then it says real big Zapata Peninsula, And then all around it, you see little Zapatas. Zapata Swamp, Zapata Swamp, Zapata Swamp. North Zapata Swamp. South the Zapata Swamp. It's surrounded by and located in Zapata. But there are still people, you can set them down with a map of Cuba and point all this out to you, and they'll say, oh, well, that's just a coincidence. It was not, in any way, shape, form, or fashion, George H.W. Bush's damn company. Thank God that this study group, the people that listen, the thousands and thousands of people that listen to this show, are not like those people. Oh, my God. That'll believe that. The Houston, the boat, the Barbara J. The ship names, it's bullshit. We know how, in 2022, the reality of how and who named those ships, ladies and gentlemen, had nothing to do with George Bush. It's misinformation. It's disinformation. It's not true. On the scale of factual inaccuracy, it's a 10 out of 10. But less than 3 months after Bush is inaugurated, Prouty is pushing this fairy tale on Harold Weisberg as if it were true. I'm going to read you the last 2 paragraphs of this letter from L. Fletcher Prouty to Harold Weisberg. This is the only part of the letter that actually pertains to this. The rest of the time he's talking about Indonesian ship movements or something. But Prouty writes, speaking of codes, did you know the code name we used for the Bay of Pigs was Zapata? We bought 2 ships for the CIA so they could support the troops on the beach. Those ships were renamed the Houston and the Barbara J. Second paragraph. Prouty writes, it just happens that after graduating from Yale, George Bush founded an oil company called Zapata. He married a girl named Barbara J., and he claims Houston as his residence. Coincidence? I said it like that because he closes the letter with coincidence, and then there are 6, no less than 6 question marks. Then it says, as always, Fletch. Every word of that, like Jim DiEugenio's review of Dr. John Newman's book, Into the Storm, is utterly, completely, tragically, comically wrong. Every damn word of those paragraphs is wrong. Colonel Prouty may as well have endorsed the Warren Report or James Files at the end of this letter. There's so little actual fact in it. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you an example, an analogy. Regular listeners, hang with me, because you know when I go off on a little tangent like this for, 90 seconds, I always have a point. All right, hang with me. I'm going to give you a real-world example of why this letter is so bothersome and why it so hurts Fletcher Prouty's credibility and why it was the most important question I asked about Prouty back in August of 2020. For sure, a real-world example of what I'm talking about. This place I'm at right now, it's where I work. It's a recording studio complex, and it is huge. We have 5 giant air handlers. Every one of these air handlers takes 15, 20 filters each. We have 68 small one-room ceiling units called VAVs. Each has 2 filters. They must be changed twice a year. All of them. We keep a maintenance contract, dear listeners, with an HVAC company to do this, and twice per year they do. They show up, they work for a day and a half, 2 days, I get a huge invoice for filters. Now, 2 years ago, that time came around. And they were here all day. A week later, I got a huge invoice. 3 weeks later, I popped open a random air handler and started looking at filters. I found filters that were new, next to filters that were 18 months old, next to filters that were 12 months old, next to filters that were new. The invoice that the man sent me was completely factually inaccurate. He put imaginary, made-up shit on paper, and he sent it to me and tried to make me believe it. And you know what happened to that HVAC contractor, dear listener? I fired his ass because I can't trust him. Because he put imaginary, made-up stuff on paper and sent it to me and tried to make me believe it. Listeners, Mr. Osanick, in this analogy, Prouty's letter to Weisberg regarding Bush in the Bay of Pigs and Operation Zapata is his fraudulent filter invoice. He committed imaginary, made-up things to paper, and he sent it to Weisberg, and he tried to make Weisberg believe it. And that's why in episode 174 of the Dallas Action, I covered that question longest and last. Because I tell you why, guys. Because after reading that letter from Prouty to Weisberg, I really couldn't give a damn what he told the ARRB. And the timing? Again, from Colonel Prouty to Weisberg, this letter containing JFK assassination disinformation is less than 3 months after Bush is inaugurated. This tells me that Colonel Prouty was on the very vanguard of the spread of this disinformation, if not the actual spearhead of it. We're going to play another soundbite from Black Op Radio. Here we go, Mr. Len Osanick.
The thing is, who takes these guys serious, you know? Just who takes them seriously?
Mr. Osanick, I'm going to give you a partial list, sir, of people who take Rob and I seriously. Michael Swanson, Gail Nix Jackson, James Wagonford, Bart Camp, Doug Horn, Alan Dale, Dr. John Newman, Dr. Jeffrey Caulfield, Dr. Walt Brown, Michael Best, Larry Hancock, Bill Simpich, David Boylan, Garland Brown, Ted Rubenstein, Francesca Akhtar, S.T. Patrick, David Knight, Owen Band, Joan Mellon, Casey Quinlan, David Denton, Gil Jesus, Brian Edwards, Dusty Rhodes, the late Dennis David, Seamus Coogan, Russ LaChapelle, Adam Go-Rightly, Larry Names, Barry Cruz, Joseph Green, Stu Wexler, Richard Gilbride, Howard K. Davis, Keith Gilbert. Oh, whoa, whoa. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I just dropped the name Howard K. Davis as if these two are going to know who the hell that is. See, dear listener, on a recent episode of Black Op Radio, both Mr. DiEugenio and Mr. Osanick admitted that they have absolutely no idea who NYPD Detective Jim Rothstein is. And I'm going to expect them to know the name Howard K. Davis?
I mean, get the hell out of here with that.
Dude, exactly. What the hell's wrong with me? Oh, where are my manners? Guys, meet Von Slap, new to Drop D Podcast Productions, manning the controls for us today. Good job, Von Slap. You know what? Now, to be fair, Mr. DiEugenio may know who that is, but Mr. Osanick is Googling it as we speak. Howard K. Davis, JFK, Dang, there's not 7 S's in assassination. Backspace. You know who else takes us very seriously, Mr. Osanick? A lady by the name of Monica Perez Jimenez takes us seriously. Monica Perez Jimenez is the daughter of former Venezuelan dictator Marcos Perez Jimenez and the daughter of Marita Lorenz. And she's also an awesomely cool, badass, wonderful lady. And she's a friend of mine, Mr. Osanick. See, Miss Jimenez, excuse me, Miss Perez Jimenez, Miss Monica, as a teenage girl, Mr. Osanick, she was apprehended by NYPD Detective Jim Rothstein while she lay in wait outside of a New York City apartment building with a handgun intent on killing Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis. And this happened on the same night that NYPD Detective Jim Rothstein arrested Frank Sturgis. Abby, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you, sir? We all heard you say so. Add to that list of people who take us seriously, Mr. Osanick, a six-figure number of podcast listeners of all varieties across the world, across 3 different podcasts, on some 40-odd websites, networks, podcatchers, apps, a 6-figure amount of people that take us seriously and growing. Hell, the amount of people who heard the Dallas Action episode number 174 presented by Wall Street Window that was critical of Fletcher Prouty, that's a 5-figure number alone, Mr. Osanick. And that is a 5-figure number of people who, A, upon hearing my episode 174, will forever take everything they ever see or hear or read attributed to L. Fletcher Prouty with an entire shaker of salt. And because they also, even more, those people and more listened to my hour-and-a-half conversation with my friend, Miss Monica Perez Jimenez, who told the whole story, they also know who Jim Rothstein is. Because they pay attention, sir. They pay attention to the details.
Now, I'm not saying you're not good at what you do.
No, sir, not at all.
I'm just saying I'm better.
Mr. Osanick, moving forward, sir, you'd be well advised. And this, I'm not speaking for me. I'm just saying, if you're going to criticize someone in the public arena, if you're going to call people a joke and call people an embarrassment, sir, you do have a responsibility, sir, and I say this with all due respect, to do your due diligence, to do your fucking homework and get the details right. Because if you don't, then those accused of being a joke, those accused of being an embarrassment, well, they make embarrassing jokes like this.
And now it's time for your Canadian radio moment of Zen.
But I heard some other guys had done a show about the lies of Fletcher Prouty, and I just laughed. I said, well, the show's over. They've just discredited themselves.
This has been your Canadian radio moment of Zen.
They make them and they play them. They upload them in the body of 3 separate podcasts every month. And they make a new one every month. And they do that till they just get bored with it. Now, I was going to wrap up right here, but one other thing occurs to me, and this is going back out to Mr. Jim DiEugenio at Kennedy's and King. I read the article, L. Fletcher Prouty versus the ARRB, very carefully, very closely. And there was one line in that article that stuck out at me, and it was extraordinary. So I'm going to take this opportunity to call on Mr. DiEugenio to provide evidence with citations that L. Fletcher Prouty at any time in his life or career ever had occasion to meet or to work with, to get to know personally by sight and true name, the CIA's George Joannides. Please give us proof, sir, evidence with citations to back up this Evel Knievel-esque leap. But I'm not going to hold my breath for that either. Now I'm done.